In 1985, beneath the pristine suburbs of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, police discovered 31 people living in an underground maze they hadn't left in 1,642 days. From the depths of my collection, The Nightmare Maestro brings you tonight a tale that reveals how easily faith can become a prison and how the most dangerous cults don't hide in remote compounds, but right beneath our feet. Detective Rachel Morrison couldn't shake the image of those conversion calendars. Each page meticulously documented the breakdown of human will, color-coded charts tracking sleep deprivation, food restriction, and darkness therapy. The most disturbing detail wasn't the abuse itself, but how ordinary everything had appeared from the outside. The Wallace family's two-story colonial on Maple Street had been picture-perfect. Manicured lawn, American flag, Sunday newspaper delivery. Even their Christmas lights stayed up exactly 30 days. No more, no less. The kind of neighbors who'd loan you a cup of sugar or collect your mail while you're away. The investigation files sprawled across Morrison's desk told a different story. Photographs revealed an elaborate underground network that made her question everything she thought she knew about suburban life. The tunnels had been professionally constructed, with reinforced walls and industrial-grade electrical systems. Someone with engineering expertise had designed this. It wasn't amateur work. The ventilation system alone must have cost a fortune, with backup generators and air filtration sophisticated enough to prevent any telltale odors from reaching the surface. What haunted Morrison most were the small details, the personal touches that showed how long this had been planned. Hidden compartments in the walls stored years' worth of preserved food. The electrical setup carefully distributed power usage across 5 different homes to avoid suspicious spikes. They'd even installed a primitive gray water recycling system. This wasn't some impulse or gradually evolved scenario. The Wallaces had designed this underground prison from the very beginning, likely before they'd even bought the house. Most chilling were the recorded interviews with neighbors. They were just so normal, was the phrase that kept repeating. The Wallaces hosted summer barbecues, attended PTA meetings, and kept their yard immaculate. Robert coached Little League. Margaret volunteered at the library. They were active in the Chamber of Commerce, the perfect cover for what lay beneath. A calculated performance that had fooled an entire community for over 6 years. Every friendly wave, every neighborly gesture had been carefully choreographed to maintain their facade while 31 souls languished in darkness below. The Wallace family maintained appearances with clockwork precision. Every Sunday morning at 9:15 a.m., Robert Wallace would back his blue Oldsmobile out of the garage, his wife Margaret in the passenger seat, wearing her finest dress and pearls. They'd return exactly 3 hours later, as if from regular church service. Neighbors would wave, admiring their devotion. Some even appreciated how they'd occasionally invite small groups over for what they called home Bible study. The recruitment process, as detailed in Robert's meticulous records, was a masterwork of psychological manipulation. It began with those seemingly innocent Bible study invitations, targeting people at vulnerable points in their lives, recent divorces, job losses, deaths in the family. Margaret would serve her special sweet tea, laced with a carefully measured combination of sedatives and hallucinogens. The doses were small at first, just enough to create a sense of peace and belonging that would keep people coming back. As dependence grew, the Wallaces would gradually increase the dosage, using the drug-induced suggestible states to implant their twisted theology. Their doctrine combined elements of mainstream Christianity with their own extremist beliefs about purification through isolation. and darkness. They preached that the modern world was irredeemably corrupt, that only by descending into their underground sanctuary could souls be saved from the coming apocalypse. The basement's upper level looked innocent enough, a typical suburban rec room with a pool table and wet bar. But behind a false wall lay the first preparation room, where new initiates would spend increasing amounts of time in isolation. The Wallaces called it light fasting, claiming it would cleanse the soul of worldly corruption. Few realized these sessions were actually tests, carefully monitoring how different personalities responded to confinement and sensory deprivation. Those who showed the most compliance would be gradually introduced to deeper levels of the complex, while anyone showing resistance would be subjected to more intensive rehabilitation protocols. The power company's meter reader, Dave Simmons, first noticed something odd in winter of '84. The Wallace house was consuming enough electricity for 3 homes its size, yet half their windows remained dark at night. When he mentioned this to his supervisor, the response was bureaucratic indifference, as long as the bills were paid on time, which they always were. But Dave couldn't let it go. He started keeping a log of other peculiarities: the grocery deliveries that seemed excessive for 2 people, the heavy-duty ventilation equipment being installed under the guise of home improvement, the occasional glimpse of pale faces in the basement windows that would quickly vanish. Most disturbing were the sounds: faint hymns at odd hours, muffled by earth and concrete, carrying a desperate quality that made his skin crawl. His concerns found a sympathetic ear in Lucy Brown, the new postal carrier on the route. She'd noticed other irregularities: the volume of mail the Wallaces received under different names, the heavy packages from medical supply companies, the letters that never seemed to go out. Together they started documenting everything, building a picture that grew more disturbing by the day. The breaking point came when Dave noticed the pattern in the power usage. Every few months, there would be a spike in consumption that lasted exactly 3 days, followed by a sharp drop. It matched the dates of what the Wallaces called their special retreats, times when the hymn singing from below would grow more intense, and strange odors would seep from the ventilation outlets. Later investigation would reveal these were initiation periods, when new members were first introduced to the underground complex through an elaborate ceremony involving sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. When Animal Control finally investigated Mrs. Henderson's missing cat complaint, Officer Jenny Martinez expected a routine call. Instead, she found herself staring at a sophisticated ventilation shaft hidden behind a false wall in the Wallace's basement. The shaft descended at least 30 feet, with metal rungs embedded in the concrete. The cat's cries echoed up from below, mixed with what sounded like human voices. The initial search warrant revealed just the first level, a series of small cell-like rooms with religious texts written on the walls in permanent marker. Each room contained a thin mattress, a bucket, and a copy of what they called the Path to Pure Light, the Wallace's own religious text. But it was the tunnel they discovered behind a sliding bookcase that hinted at the true scope. It led to the basement of the house next door, and another beyond that, forming an underground network that would take weeks to fully map. The SWAT team that first entered the complex described an atmosphere of absolute control. The air itself felt heavy with fear and submission. Motion sensors and security cameras covered every corridor, feeding to a central monitoring station in Robert's private office. The deeper they went, the more the complex seemed designed to disorient. Corridors that curved just enough to disrupt straight sight lines, acoustic treatments that made it impossible to tell where sounds originated, lighting that could be adjusted to create artificial day-night cycles or complete darkness at will. Most disturbing were the conditioning rooms, specially designed cells where new members would be subjected to varying periods of sensory deprivation. The walls were lined with sound-dampening material, and the ventilation system could be adjusted to alter oxygen levels subtly, inducing mild hypoxia that made residents more susceptible to suggestion. Everything was engineered to break down resistance and create dependence on the leaders. The conversion calendars found in Robert Wallace's office detailed a systematic process of breaking down resistance through what they called darkness protocols. New members would be gradually introduced to longer periods in lightless underground rooms, told that darkness was necessary to purge worldly corruption. The periods would start small, just an hour or two, but they would stretch longer and longer, marked in neat red ink on the calendars, until some subjects were living in perpetual darkness. The calendars revealed a chilling level of psychological insight. Each subject's progress was tracked across multiple variables: sleep patterns, eating habits, emotional responses, level of doctrinal adherence. The Wallaces had created a scoring system to measure what they called light dependency, how attached someone remained to the outside world. Those showing high scores would be subjected to more intensive darkness periods, while those who adapted well would be granted special privileges, like being allowed to help guide newer members through their own darkness protocols. Medical records seized from the complex showed the physical toll of these practices. Many residents developed severe vitamin D deficiencies, their skin turning almost translucent from years without sunlight. Their eyes became hypersensitive to light, making escape even more difficult as time went on. But the psychological damage was even more severe. Residents who had been there longest showed signs of complete dissociation from reality, their sense of time and self distorted by years of manipulation. The margins of the calendars contained Robert's personal observations, revealing both his clinical detachment and twisted vision. Subject 17, showing promising neural plasticity, darkness tolerance increasing rapidly. Subject 24, experiencing temporal disconnection after 14 days, ready for deep doctrine. Subject 28, still expressing individual will. Recommend extended sensory reduction protocol. He viewed it all as a grand experiment in human transformation, believing he was perfecting a method to free souls from the prison of physical existence. What finally shattered the Wallaces' carefully constructed world wasn't police work or neighbor suspicions. It was love. Among their prisoners were two young adults, Michael Young and Shirley Winters, who had developed a secret relationship despite the strict gender segregation protocols. In the darkness of the underground complex, they found moments of human connection during mandatory prayer sessions, their fingers barely touching as they knelt side by side. Their furtive communication began with simple hand squeezes, 1 for hope, 2 for courage, 3 for love. Over months, they developed their own silent language in the darkness. Shirley, who worked in food preparation, would arrange specific patterns with dried beans on Michael's meal tray. Michael, who cleaned the prayer halls, would leave barely perceptible marks on Shirley's designated prayer mat. Each tiny act of rebellion gave them something the darkness couldn't take: choice. The stakes escalated when Shirley discovered she was pregnant. Previous pregnancies in the complex had ended in tragedy. Mothers disappeared into the meditation chambers for months, returning hollow-eyed and alone. The official doctrine claimed these children were too pure for the corrupted physical realm. But late at night, Some whispered about crying sounds from behind the medical bay's walls. Their escape wasn't born of careful planning, but desperate necessity. During evening prayers, Shirley fainted, a common occurrence in the stale basement air. But this time was different. Instead of allowing the usual handlers to take her to the medical bay, Michael broke ranks. In the confusion that followed, they fled deeper into the basement, rather than toward the obvious exits. Having cleaned these areas for months, Michael knew the Wallaces' attention focused on controlling access from above, not below. They ran through the darkness they'd learned to navigate by touch and sound, past the hymn-filled prayer halls and into the storage areas. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and the sound of footsteps echoed off concrete walls. The pursuit wasn't just about catching two runners. The Wallaces couldn't risk anyone discovering what lay in the deeper rooms. When they hit a dead end, Michael felt along the wall for the old coal chute he'd discovered during his cleaning duties. As boots thundered closer, Shirley wedged herself into the narrow passage first. The rusted cover wouldn't close with both of them inside. Someone would have to stay behind. In that moment of choice, their hands squeezed one last time. 1, 2, 3. Michael pushed her forward and turned to face the approaching lights. Shirley crawled through what felt like endless darkness, her pregnant belly scraping against cold metal, following the faint thread of fresh air. When she finally emerged into Mrs. Henderson's garage through an old coal delivery door, the evening sky nearly blinded her. She couldn't walk straight after years underground, but she knew she had to move. Michael had given her this chance, and she carried more than just her own life now. The raid that followed revealed the true face of Robert Wallace's church. Born in a dying coal town in Kentucky, Robert had spent his childhood watching his father descend daily into the mines. After a cave-in killed his father and trapped young Robert for 6 days, something in him twisted. He emerged believing he'd found profound truth in that darkness, that human consciousness was poisoned by light and physical existence. The basement complex wasn't just a hidden congregation space. It was his attempt to recreate that revelation. Using the existing foundation and old coal rooms of these century-old homes, he'd gradually expanded the underground space. Each room was designed to break down the human spirit through calculated darkness and isolation. The most devoted subjects would eventually reach the bottommost chamber where no light had ever penetrated. Here, in what he called the Genesis Room, people would spend months in total darkness, marking time only by the hymns piped through hidden speakers. The survivors emerged into daylight like deep-sea creatures pulled from their trenches. Some had been underground so long their bodies had adapted. Vitamin D deficiency had softened their bones, their skin had lost all pigment, their eyes had become hypersensitive to even the dimmest light. But the physical changes paled compared to the psychological damage. Many had lost all sense of time and self, their identities dissolved by years of darkness and Wallace's relentless doctrine. During his interrogation, Robert displayed no remorse. He spoke of his work with the fervor of a man who genuinely believed he was saving souls. The basement's detailed records revealed how he had refined his methods through trial and error, learning exactly how long it took to break down different personalities through darkness and isolation. His journals spoke of liberating people from their physical forms, describing with clinical detachment how some subjects began reporting visions after months without light. Shirley's testimony proved crucial in understanding the complex true nature, but she never discovered Michael's fate. The deepest parts of the basement remained partially unexplored. Some areas had collapsed or been deliberately sealed. Years later, the motion sensors installed in the filled-in basement still occasionally trigger, though investigators insist it's just settling concrete and old pipes. The house on Maple Street was demolished, its basement filled with concrete. But sometimes, late at night, residents swear they can hear faint hymns drifting up through the ground. The kind of hymns that make you question whether Robert Wallace was completely wrong. If somewhere in the darkness, human consciousness can change into something else entirely, something that no longer needs the light. If this tale of darkness touched something primal in your soul, share your thoughts below. What secrets might be hidden in your own neighborhood's forgotten coal cellars and sealed basements? Don't forget to subscribe to the Nightmare Maestro's channel and hit that notification bell for more uncovered horrors that lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life.